Common ground, common duty. Open humanities and the global south. I would like to thank everyone from the University of Cambridge's Open Research community for giving me this honor to deliver this keynote lecture at this year's Open Research Conference. My thanks in particular to Mandy, Nicola, Samuel, and everyone at the Cambridge Office for Scholarly Communications, at the Cambridge University Library, as well as broadly to the Cambridge Open Research community. It might seem like a curious place to begin. A small photocopy shop just north of New Delhi. A photocopy shop whose significance to open research policies around the world cannot be overstated. A photocopy shop nestled serenely, unsuspectingly, and almost certainly oblivious to its own importance between the Faculty of Arts, where I was once a postgraduate student, and the Vishwavidyalaya metro station. Only much later, long after I had moved to Delhi proper, did I come to think of the meaning of the word Vishwavidyalaya. Etymologically, in Sanskrit, the word comes from Vishwa, universe, and Vidyalaya, school, meaning university. Like in English, it signifies a world constituted by the universe, a world without exclusions. University from the Latin universus, meaning whole, without divisions. When you step out at Vishwavidyalaya, you find yourself in a crowd of students, many of them travelling from places much further away than I, some of them having started their journeys at 5 in the morning. At the station, it became everyday custom to share, after some haggling, a human-pulled rickshaw. It would slowly wheel past an alley full of honking cars and into the road that led into the Delhi School of Economics. It was here, in the afternoons, that I would see the Rameshwari photocopy service in the distance, almost always deluged by a sweeping crowd. There were long queues of students who were there to print their dissertations, get notes photocopied, get posters for seminars laminated. The lecture rooms, by the time you reached them, were so packed full of them that you would often either sit on the windowsills or on the floors outside, hoping to catch whatever sound still made its way to you. Nobody had any time to read your essays. Learning was, in a sense, left up entirely to the student, making it all the more important that resources were available. It was not until several weeks into my postgraduate program in English and Translation that the faculty divided our large cohort of 250 students into smaller groups of 25. I needed to avail the services of this photocopy shop at last. Most, if not all, of the professors would deposit here, as I learnt was an old practice, a copy of their prescribed week-by-week readings. Either all of us, including the shopkeepers, ignored copyright law, or, which was more likely, simply not aware of its implications. And to this day I remember, and I'll probably never forget, just how the shop clicked into action like a well-oiled machine when you entered into it and asked for the material you needed. You would say the name not of the book or the author, but of the professor who prescribed it. Any professor, over 400 of them spread across several faculties and departments in the university. The shop was loud and rambunctious, like something out of a fantasy novel, but had, of course, an inscrutable odor of its own. I remember saying the name of my professor, and this man, with the help of a large wooden stick, pulled out an unlabeled spiral-bound document from a vast sea of identical files stacked on top of each other, and flung it over to a boy in the corner who made an instantaneous copy of it. Within a few months, I returned to the classroom with a set of 12 readings, costing me exactly 50 rupees, already an amount for which existed photocopying bursaries in the university for those who needed them. These materials alone would have otherwise legally cost me, or the University of Delhi, over £400. This is more than the amount of money I paid for 6 years of my education in New Delhi, for 2 entire degrees. A few years later, we heard that multiple university presses had gathered lawyers to sue the Rameshwari photocopy services for damages they could never pay. Oxford, Cambridge, Taylor and Francis were all among those wanting a temporary injunction against the shop. Many student activists and legal groups in India rose up in its defense, several of them having benefited from its fugitive photocopying practice. And despite repeated appeals, the Supreme Court of India, one of the world's most respected bodies of legal opinion at the time, ruled in favor of the photocopy shop, setting out a principle that knowledge for pedagogic access was a fundamentally open public good. And though the copyright applied in other instances, the use of this material in instruction fell within the bounds of fair dealing and therefore a legitimate copyright exemption. The ruling sent shockwaves throughout the academic publishing world, whose financial model depended on paid use within precisely these educational contexts. As a student, there was much I loathed about this way of approaching pedagogy. We were never encouraged to look beyond the spiral-bound notebook thrown into our hands. I, who was misguided then, thought at first that these readings, which had scarcely been changed in years, contributed to dogmas around what a subject was, to encrusted ideas rather than to original thinking. That we as students did not approach our subject with boldness or curiosity, but were told to stay within the bounds of the textbooks compiled for us. Today, when I think of that moment in 2014, almost 10 years ago now, when the photocopy shop was threatened with closure and the police gathered outside the Delhi School of Economics with a court injunction against it, I do not think of the vague necessities for a new doctrine or theory, a new and more trendy intellectual school, a new journal that was all the rage and we never studied. I do not think about the geo-humanities or the global humanities, nor of world literature or the Anthropocene, all things I learnt about after coming to Cambridge. I thought of someone reading an essay, published, say, in 1976, that fell off the shelf of an old photocopy shop and transformed all the same the way they saw the world and their own place inside it. I think of something Edward Said, the Palestinian-American academic, said about the intellectual as a necessarily amateur figure. He said this in 1993 in lecture later published as part of the book, The Representations of the Intellectual. Everything I have said in these lectures underlines the importance of the intellectual of passionate engagement, risk, exposure, commitment to principles, vulnerability in debating, and being involved in worldly causes. The difference I drew earlier between a professional and an amateur intellectual rests precisely on this, that the professional claims detachment on the basis of a profession and pretends to objectivity, whereas the amateur is moved neither by reward nor by the fulfillment of an immediate career, but by his commitment to ideas and values in the public sphere. What is the public sphere, and why should it matter? Today, when I think about the public sphere, I think about Antonio Gramsci's prison notebooks, smuggled out and covertly disseminated amongst the politically engaged reading publics in 30s Italy. I think about the proscribed literary pamphlets from the anti-colonial world and how Pascal Casanova, the French literary scholar, speaks of a world republic of letters constituted by spheres of the public across which literatures and ideas can traverse without barriers. I think, of course, of Jürgen Habermas's landmark 1989 book, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, in which he recognizes a text or a narrative's structural function in articulating subjectivity and building social collectivities. When I think about this public sphere today, and that of the task of the intellectual as set out by Edward Said, I think also about the translator and literary historian Francesca Orsini, who demonstrates how the confluence of literatures across several languages in India came to produce the Indian public sphere, a rich and dynamic tapestry, deeply multilingual, deeply translational, and yet there is, I think, beyond all of this, a manifestation of the public sphere that is more colloquial, more naive, more formative. What is this public sphere? When does one become, perhaps as a student, aware of their capacity to affect a transformation of the public sphere? Before I present the entwined concepts of common ground and common duty, I want to recount another story of fugitive classroom practice. This one is from 2004, from almost 20 years ago, when I was still in school. A friend of mine, I do not know what became of him or where he is anymore. I do not even remember his name, except that we called him Gilheri, meaning squirrel, because he was very short, good at climbing poles, and broke into rooms through windows, walked into our classroom one morning with a DVD of the Britannica Encyclopedia, and said that he was on an important mission and that I must help him. Since neither of us had computers at home yet, he said the only way was to return to the school in the evenings after play, bundle ourselves into the computer room through the window, boot up Windows 98 machine that lay there, and rewrite the contents of the Britannica Encyclopedia onto a free and openly accessible website on the dial-up called Wikipedia. I chose dogs and their breeds, and he chose the rulers of the Mughal dynasty. Until it all got very boring and tedious, and so I gave up, but I think he kept at it, his sentences barely legible through his broken and juvenile grammar, being copied from Britannica to Wikipedia with sufficient distinctions such as to not be called plagiarism. There is much to be said about Wikipedia, and much to be said about the open software movement. Much to be said about fugitive practice or about #PDF tribute. There is much to be said about the legalities and the customs of intellectual ownership within open source and Wikipedia editing communities. And there is yet more to be said of the disenchantments and the troubling manifestations of what we call open culture, its paradoxical ability to throttle inclusion, or, to quote Eric Raymond from his book The Cathedral and the Bazaar, under the heading The Revenge of the Hackers, its ability to spawn, in quotes, accidental revolutionaries. But I dwell today mostly upon that moment in my school of my now forgotten friend as a moment of quite remarkable, precocious epiphany, a realization beyond anything else of the existence of a public sphere, a world outside the classroom, an awareness of this world, a world that not only exists but can be touched, claimed, inscribed upon, even transformed. In a pamphlet written by the legendary American abolitionist Ruth Gilmore when she was still a graduate student at Yale in 1967, she argues that a contest was playing out within American institutions that would fundamentally alter the destinies of American campuses, as well as the face of knowledge, which she defined as oppositional culture in times of crisis. The crisis, of course, was that of apartheid America and its culture of brutal incarceration, segregation, and racial violence. Gilmore, who grounded her ideas and thinking firmly in the public sphere, argued that this contest was between, on one hand, public intellectuals, and on the other, their private enemies. Connecting, presciently, the various dots which have, over time, become only more obviously constellated, she writes, "The formation of private intellectuals is taking place as apartheid. The political logic of late capitalism arranges our future through control of our space. Both the political economy and the culture of the campus serve to legitimate the movement of what should be public to exclusive and increasingly private spheres. Such a movement runs in direct opposition to oppositional culture, which is originally and finally public culture." What has always surprised me about Cambridge is how easy it makes it to lose sight of the world outside. How it occludes for those within this institution any view of what Ruth Gilmore has called public culture. We are cloistered within its walls, within the perimeter of its comforts, within its oblique architectures and its impermeable vocabularies, made subject, often unsuspectingly, to its roll call of problems and its agenda items. How easy it is here for the world outside to become an abstraction, something intangible, something to be abdicated to pure academic inquiry, something that teeters at the threshold of reality and consequentially at the edge of the commonality of our experience, by which I mean at the edge of both the common ground we share with this world and the common duty that we share with it. Ruth Gilmore thought this world treacherous, reeking of privilege, though she corrected herself many years later with respect to some of the things she says in the pamphlet, including that Harlem Renaissance, a movement in want of aesthetic vogue, represented a form of capitulation, that it represented insularity instead of oppositionality, assimilation instead of subversion. She stuck by her assessment, most trenchantly, of the Frankfurt School. "I am not of the Frankfurt School," she says, referring to the famously dense intellectual practice of the time. "One must live a life of relative privilege these days to be so dour about domination, so suspicious of resistance, so enchanted by commodification, so helpless before the ideological state apparatuses to conclude that there is no conceivable end to late capitalism's daily sacrifice of human life to the singular freedom of the market." Challenging thus the purported radicalism of the Frankfurt School, and even that of many black intellectuals of the time, Ruth Gilmore refers her reader to poet-warrior Audre Lorde and radical intellectual Paulo Freire. Using Lorde's now famous dictum that the master's tools will not destroy the master's house, and Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, Ruth Gilmore holds the figure of the intellectual to an unsparing flame of moral reckoning. She writes that there are four ways in which the seemingly radical agenda of oppositional studies gets evacuated of its meaning and of its political potency. Even today, these are, it can be argued, the very obstacles to building a truly open research culture and a truly integral intellectual practice. A. Individual careerism. B. Romantic particularism. C. Luxury production, which she also calls insider trading, referring to much of the thing that gets written but not shared with the public. And D. Organic praxis. This four-legged march of oppositional studies, she argues, is built entirely out of the master's tools. And such an oppositional studies is dogmatic as it forms a blunt weapon. Its calls for inclusions of the disenfranchised groups into the intellectual and social fabric of the university is meaningless, for such an inclusion does not map onto the inclusion of the same people into the social structure of the world. The profusion of black intellectuals will not by itself annihilate, that is, the school-to-prison pipeline in the UK. The representation of South Asian academics will not just by itself mean decolonization or decarceration. For Ruth Gilmore, all it produces, and I quote, is a class of intellectuals so polished in the language of transformation, but so disinclined or so incapable of bringing about the true realignment of the fatal coupling of power and difference. What caution might we, as intellectuals committed to making university culture more open, more accessible, more collaborative, more public, and therefore more oppositional, may take from her, from the ideas of Audre Lorde or from Paulo Freire? It is admittedly odd to frame the illusion that I spoke of in terms of an inside and an outside of a university, for it appears to further untether us from the common political and material reality that we inhabit. Yet I think people here will understand and relate to this expression. To many of us, the world outside is our area of scholarship, our field site, our archives, our world literatures, our disappearing languages, our globalizing economies, and certainly, as I like to think as a migrant worker in this university, even our homes, the constituencies we represent, the people we have come from, and sometimes unreturnably, the places we have left behind. Before coming to Cambridge, I studied English and translation at the University of Delhi on an other backward castes or OBC reservation, which is now a politically threatened affirmative action program for students from disadvantaged caste backgrounds to study at elite public institutions in India. To many of us in the open research community, India might appear as a middle-income country, a middle-income academic publishing economy. So its academic publishing landscape is judged and priced according to those adjustment factors. It is above Sudan or Yemen, but below South Africa, Italy, Germany, or France. India is an item that appears in the middle of the list being the lens that homogenizes it completely, renders it as one entity, a poster face for the impoverished global South. This is itself, I think, an abstraction of its variegated linguistic, economic, and political landscapes. These abstractions are lazy but enduring. The global South encapsulates those on the frontiers of the formerly colonized world, but as a category it exists as an abstract counterpoint to the metropolitan global North, a territory of meaning entirely severed from the West except in its expression of difference from it. Even when this abstract category threatens upon us a political, material, or epistemological reality with calls to decolonize our curricula, to make our hiring practices more inclusive, our student bodies more diverse, our knowledge outputs more open, our road statues befallen, our tuition fees abolished, it succumbs ultimately, I think, to a stubborn illusion, a fragmentation of the world between an inside and an outside. I'm yet to encounter an intellectual practice, including my own, that does not, at some unconscious level, attempt to domesticate a real world into an abstract imagination. On the other hand, it is easy to imagine the world outside as a somewhat embattled abstraction when we are cloistered inside, within the university. A university which we are assured is becoming increasingly more inclusive and more diverse, opening itself out to the world, even though the evidence disagrees fervently. Tuition fees are rocketing through the roof, precarious grant-funded research gigs are becoming the norm, and the very existence within this profession of many who do not come from wealthy backgrounds is under unprecedented threat. It would even seem that to still imagine the world outside as embattled and beset by crises has become, for the professional academic, a sort of a ritual. For were this world not so embattled, it would not be his area of work, his subject of inquiry, his dusty digging site or logging field, his war-torn or impoverished landscape. I wonder perhaps that it has become even necessary to imagine this world outside as embattled in some way, so that it might offer, for the academic who depends upon it, the dynamic, eventful, and contentious intellectual sphere engendered by its circumstances. The illusion also demands that we imagine the university as a space that is at rest, without activity, regulated by itself, frozen in a state of homeostasis, something so tender, so placatory, and so neutral that it is easy to be accustomed to its delusions and to find it outside the remit of critique. The metropolitan university, such as the one from which I speak, demands this kind of indemnity. It asks us to imagine itself as the norm from which the world deviates, the imperial center in aspiration of which the world labors and strives. Its ethos is universal, its methods undisputed. Here, we are encouraged to feel that we have no stakes in transforming the world we see as embattled, that our practice, again ritualized by cover letters and grant applications and incessant meetings and all the cogs and pinions of professionalized academia, is merely that of observing, archiving, recording, regurgitating, and enumerating this world. These practices are not, of course, to be admonished en masse, nor do they represent always the banalization of intellectual labor under the doom of privatization. Only that the self-defeating irony is, by acting thus under the force of this illusion, we take space within the very world we imagine is outside of us, a world we wrongly assume is unaffected by the propositions we make and the histories we write and the ethnographies within which we subjectify it. A world whose abstraction is so common that we do not think it a dialectical necessity of our work, that it is made part and parcel of our intellectual endeavor. And so I think gathers like a dense fog this definitive, even perhaps the most stubborn illusion of intellectual practice under the conditions of neoliberal academia, the birth, as Ruth and Gilmore would have it, of the private enemy. This is the illusion of an intellectual who dares think that they are not embedded in the world about which they write. An intellectual who thinks themselves as an unaccounted entity placed outside the purview of their analysis. Where we do not have a demanding relationship with what exactly our work accomplishes when it sails out into the world, through its classrooms and its town halls and its book fairs, carried by its flows of power and capital, at long last into the global south, we succumb to this exact illusion of a dichotomous world, a world inside and a world outside. Where we do not think that the work of our work is, out as it goes, rubber-stamped by a university governed by the logics of the market and the degenerating forces of neoliberalism, in which the work of the work, as it were, becomes the progression of a career, we succumb to this illusion of a dichotomous world, inside and outside. Where we think of open access as only a matter of dissemination of knowledge, not as something that structures the very form, content, voice, and positionality of this knowledge, where we think of it only as a policy aim or a compliance nightmare, and objectify the nuisance or complexity as something almost in theory but not quite under the current economic model possible, where we forgo the unsparing moral language in which the culture of open knowledge is forged in favor of honoring only its legal and administrative antecedents, where we forget that open knowledge was and is first and foremost a fugitive practice, a grassroots movement, we succumb to this illusion of a dichotomous world, a world inside and a world outside. And so, in lieu of my argument, I offer that this illusion is precisely what constitutes for me the loss of common ground and the surrender of our common duty, a desecration of the relatively safe and privileged corner we have come to occupy as intellectuals in the thoroughly embattled world that we inhabit today. Despite knowing fully well how slippery and ethereal this illusion is, and how well precedented it is by our colonial and racial pasts, I am always surprised and caught off guard when it comes up, and I feel guilty whenever I succumb to its logic, something I believe that we all do from time to time. In their book The Undercommons, Stefano Harney and Fred Moten postulate, in obvious defense of intellectualism in times of crisis, that the only relationship we can have to the university today is a criminal one. They write, "It cannot be denied that the university is a place of refuge, and it cannot be accepted that the university is a place of enlightenment. In the face of these conditions, one can only sneak into the university and steal what one can, to abuse its hospitality, to spite its mission, to join its refugee colony, its gypsy encampment, to be in but not of. This is the path of the subversive intellectual in the modern university." Whilst as part of our occupation as academics, we often gather in spaces like this to talk about the world in terms more conspicuously academic than we are afforded to on this occasion, we are always in danger of construing this world and talking about it as though it were an abstraction. A world that is, to quote Edward Said again, textually bound and created. On the other hand, I think it is very difficult to unsee this danger when speaking about open knowledge, open access, open humanities, or the open university. It is impossible, that is, for me to talk about openness without unabstracting, unfolding, or making obvious the very real and the very extractive terms upon which our abstractions have been accumulated, the very extractive terms upon which we share and disseminate the knowledge that we make, and the very terms upon which we have built our perimeters and our fenced gardens and our cloisters. The very terms upon which we have erected what Stanley Aronowitz has called the knowledge factory, a factory characterized by the expropriative transfer of knowledge into the realms of private capital. It may be yet possible for a scholar of Indian literature such as myself to succumb to the illusion, by itself treacherous, that this India that forms the bulk of my subject exists only as an abstraction. It is quite impossible for me to sustain this illusion when faced with the irony of coming across a student of literature from India emailing me to ask for a copy of something that I have written because their university cannot afford it. There is no moment in the humanities, I will go on to say, that threatens more to uncover the abstract and illusory tendencies of intellectual work, to expose its inner trading, to quote Ruth and Gilmore, no matter how rigorous or well-versed. There is no moment that threatens, for me, the dissolution of academia altogether as a public practice, than this moment of material confrontation with those that have been rendered outside it, a moment that punctures the very logic of the university, the principles of the universal commons inscribed into its name, a moment that cannot be turned into an abstraction no matter how hard one tries. It may not enact at the outset the sorts of epistemic violence which are perhaps more insidious, and which have rightfully been the subject of sustained scrutiny for those seeking to decolonize our universities, a movement itself at the risk of being appropriated by managerialism, but its exclusions are more vulgar, more unmistakable, more defiantly real, and more resistant to being concealed or worse reappropriated as a matter for crawling and patient transformation. How might we refuse or quarrel with this agenda of intermittent celebration and demand rapid transformation when it comes to making humanities openly and universally accessible? And can we do it by acknowledging that universities, despite their deep complicities in the global networks of power consolidation, have also been a space most amenable to this transformation, a place of refuge, to quote Morton and Harney. Chandra Talpade Mohanty, in her 2003 book Feminism Without Borders, pinpoints precisely this contradictory nature of university spaces. She identifies first the complicity of universities' closed-access knowledge systems, which she refers to as capitalization, in the rampant and unchecked parade of global capitalism. She writes, "The capitalization of knowledge is one of the most profound ways the universities serve as a catalyst for the onward march of global capitalism, a march ably facilitated by knowledge and information technologies in the early years of the century." But she also identifies that universities have been a contradictory space, a site of feminist struggle where knowledge is both colonized and contested, a place that engenders student mobilizations and progressive movements of various kinds. It is one of the few remaining spaces in a rapidly privatized world that offers some semblance of a public arena for dialogue, engagement, and visioning of democracy and justice. And with her assessment of the university space in its current iteration as utterly indispensable to building something radically open and accessible, I wholeheartedly agree. I propose further that the global south has to be more than the beneficiary of this endeavor. It has to be at its vanguard, leading its transformation in ways that can manifest upon the terrain of its struggle, the common ground constituted by its value systems, ethical challenges, critical advocacies, and political actions. No better common ground exists upon which to inscribe the democratic struggle of making humanities more open and accessible, more legible to the constituencies affected by its outcomes, than the struggle for repatriation that already exists all around us, incessantly challenging our universities to reckon with its troubling pasts and upholding the moral imperatives they have to a just future. This is the struggle for decolonization, our common duty, to which I shall dedicate the final section of my lecture. What I find genuinely liberatory about decolonization as a demand, and this need hardly be said, is it is persistent and tenacious without being a compliance nightmare, something that has been asked to be done from above. What I find genuinely powerful about decolonization as a demand is that it operates foremost as an ethical and a moral ask. Though no doubt a certain diversity of curriculum sold in lieu of decolonization is bound to attract students from Asia, Africa, and the Pacific to our universities, and though it is true that the cultural vogue now associated with it means that it suddenly looks good for universities to say they're decolonizing, decolonization is necessarily an adversarial and discomforting process, one that leaves the colonial entity with less than what it started with. To quote Eve Tuck and Kevin Young, decolonization is not a metaphor. It is not a stand-in term for social justice, nor it is an agenda for diversification of reading lists. Decolonization entails real and material demands. It asks for concessions of power, for repatriation of land, objects, capital, stolen opportunities, and past injustices. To inscribe this struggle and the challenges of making humanities more open onto the struggle for decolonization is not to leverage its trendiness, nor it is to make it more metaphorical, but to acknowledge and point out that the historical origins of the forms of private value upon which is erected a paywalled university is inextricably linked to the historical forces of colonialism and racial capitalism. To see the opening of the humanities thus as one of the aims of decolonization also means that we see the international copyright system as a legacy and a doctrine of colonialism, one that requisitioned its more lethal violations of life. Such a task is taken up by Laurelyn Witt in her 2009 essay, Intellectual Property Rights as Means and Mechanism of Imperialism. She writes, "The inclusion of intellectual laborers in the marketplace required a significant conceptual transformation. Not only did the nature of writing need to be reconceived, but so did the nature of knowledge. Knowledge, or more exactly ideas, became something that no longer needed to remain in the public domain. It was able to be transformed into private property, provided that it was, in quotes, original, and was fixed in some physical form. It could then be exchanged in the marketplace as a commodity to be bought or sold." She explores this in further detail, challenging individualism, evidentialism, quantified bases of argumentation, standardizations of the indigenous vernaculars, the making of maps and the writing of ledgers as each products of colonial rationalities. Cautioning against the recourse of law in the struggle for an open and deprivatized intellectual culture, Witt argues that a radically new university would need to be imagined in the place of what stands today. A university built precisely for the common good, always at odds with expansionism, assimilationism, and extractivism, all modi operandi of colonialism's past and present, which continue to determine the structures of our university, which continue to throb through its febrile, copyright-based regimes of governance. With great moral clarity and argumentative force, Priyamvada Gopal puts forward 4 ways in which decolonization might occur within the bounds of the university. 4 ways in which we might seek to decolonize our institutions, 4 things to bear in mind as we resist mounting institutional pressure to make decolonization, not unlike open access itself, into a victory parade. First, acknowledging that much of what we take for granted, methodologies, practices, disciplines, in university contexts in the West and beyond, are still structured by the imperatives of the European imperial enterprise, also racial capitalism, and its attendant activities of extraction and ownership. The university was not and is not separable from the endeavors of discovery and control." End quote. To acknowledge in our case that even closed access scholarship was not a neutral historical process, that is, but a path smelted in the demands of colonialism, the ways in which knowledge was used alongside the ship and the gun as the technology of control and interpellation. 2. The loss, mutilation, and marginalization of bodies of knowledge and ideas as Europe became, and in many ways remains, the primary arbiter of what was worth knowing and how it is known. This is to acknowledge that Eurocentrism and Anglocentrism are also sustained by the economic models of publication and dissemination that marginalize bodies of scholarship in the global south. 3. Excavating and recognizing lines of influence that run from non-Europe to Europe. These lines are notably reversed here. It is worth emphasizing again that no version of the open humanities in which the global south is imagined as an embattled and abstract outside world to be saved by the metropolitan north can actually help save and enrich university culture here and now. And fourth, opening pathways to dialogue and mutually transformative engagement between different cultures, traditions, and approaches to knowledge. We might even call this process relinking, end quotes. Building upon some of these ideas and propositions, I present in summary the common ground and common duty. I invite us all to think of open humanities as a form of knowledge work that seeks to alter both the form and the content of knowledge systems, rather than just opening Euro-American knowledge systems to global publics. That is, I invite us all to see it not as an expression of duty from the global north to the global south, but an expression of a collective struggle. To see it as not simply publicly engaged, but a form of knowledge work that actually produces new common publics by relinking, recuperating, remediating, and repairing past injustices, including the enduring injustice of the copyright system. We are placed uniquely today to not only advance the shape of the current conversation on open access as a policy program, but also as something that I think forces us to disavow our abstract relationship to the world in favor of a material one. Something that can break the perimeter of our comfort, that can disrupt and democratize what we call knowledge, that can overcome this threshold of reality that holds us in rapture, reaffirming at some level the commonality to which I gesture, the contiguity of the world that appears as an inside and an outside, the contiguity of the world within academia and without, a world that stretches from the global north to the global south, and a world that implicates them both, holding them both accountable.